Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We're having some technical troubles on this end. We think that we're going to be able to show tonight's program on the Zoom easily and maybe with a little more difficulty here for the in-person part. Anyway, hello. Welcome to the Sierra Club Huron Valley Group. This is our hybrid monthly program for April 2022. The Easter, Passover, Ramadan, Spring Flowers, and Spring Snow edition. We're the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is the nation's oldest and largest environmental group. Our motto is explore, enjoy, and protect the earth. If you aren't already a member, please join at sierraclub.org. The Huron Valley Group is the Sierra Club group that represents Washtenaw, Monroe, and Lenawee counties. My name is Dan Ezekiel, and I'm the program chair for the Huron Valley Group. Let's just take a minute and honor the people of Ukraine and anyone who suffers at the hands of power-hungry leaders. This is the fourth partially in-person HVG program that we've had after 2 years of entirely Zoom. If you want to come in person here at the Botanical Gardens, we ask that you be vaxxed, boosted, and masked. We're going to keep using this hybrid model in the months to come. Sign up to attend in person or virtual on our meetup page. And as always, I want to thank Una Woodbury, who makes this possible, and she's right here. So maybe the people here can give her a hand. She's earning her keep tonight. Okay, we like to share wins at these meetings. We hope you enjoyed the new and improved newsletter, which is electronic only. If you haven't opened it in your mailbox, please do. John Metzler, who's here tonight. John, you want to wave? Right there. He has stepped up as our new communications chair, and we envision the newsletter as the future of two-way communication between our group and our members. You're encouraged to send in a letter, a photo, a brief editorial, or a brief article. Look for the next edition this summer. I also want to share the midterm election in November is a huge priority for us. One of the most effective ways we can help elect and re-elect environmentalists to public office is to write letters to low inclination voters, encouraging them to vote. Low inclination voters are people who are registered to vote, but they often don't vote. In 2020, the Huron Valley Group wrote over 1,500 handwritten letters to such voters, and we're ramping up again. We held our first letter writing session last month, and we produced 160 letters to low inclination Michigan voters for this fall. And our next letter writing session is going to be in person at the Argus Farm Stop on Packard, 1200 Packard, a week from this evening, Tuesday, April 26th, from 6 to 8 p.m. We'll be writing personal letters to low inclination voters from historically underrepresented populations here in Michigan, encouraging them to vote in November. Please bring 20 envelopes and 20 stamps if you can, but don't let your inability to do so stop you from coming. We can provide the envelopes and stamps. What's really important is your heartfelt letters to these voters. So again, Tuesday, April 26th, a week from tonight, 6 to 8 p.m. at the Argus Farm Stop on Packard down in the basement. All right. Nancy, book club?
Okay, am I lined up right? Okay. We have a book group that the Huron Valley Group runs every second Tuesday of the month from September to May. And our upcoming one will be second Tuesday in May, which I think is the 12th. Our book for that month is entitled A Very Short History of Life on Earth, 4.6 billion years in 12 pithy chapters by Henry G. I don't know if that's visible or not, but it's available at Nicholas. We meet virtually with the hookups through Meetup, and or you can contact me at nschiffler@comcast.net, and I will set you up with a link to get in virtually. We meet those nights starting at 7:30 and for about an hour to an hour and a half with a variety of books. So this one is our last one until next September. So I hope you'll join us. Thanks.
So next month's program is going to be really cool. Bob Sutherland, the founder and owner of the stores called Cherry Republic, will be here to tell us about peace, love, and cherries. And he describes his talk as follows: a humorous, touching account of Bob's lifetime of entrepreneuring in a small town in northern Michigan. The talk will be a love story of cherries, of Michigan, of taking risks and hard work, of a business bent on survival to one evolving into values, a larger mission, and making a difference in my community, in northern Michigan's woods and wilds, and Mother Earth overall. So that program is going to be on Tuesday, May 17th, right here, both in person and on this same Zoom link at 7:30 p.m. So Tuesday, May 17th, 7:30 p.m. It will be on Meetup like always. And there may be a special something that goes along with Bob Sutherland's presentation. Watch for hints in days to come. So tonight is also going to be very special. We have Dr. Jacqueline Corteau. She's a plant biologist, formerly with the University of Michigan. I just learned tonight she did her undergrad at Harvard. She's going to be sharing her research about the effect of deer populations on the environment. And she will explain this to you better than I can. But I'm going to put on my middle school hat right now and say the following. Before Dr. Corteau begins her presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that topics involving deer are quite controversial, even among fellow environmentalists. Emotions often run high when this topic or topics related to deer are discussed. The purpose of this meeting and of all HVG program meetings is primarily listening and learning from experts. Dr. Corteau is here as a veteran plant biologist and has graciously agreed to share her expertise with us at my invitation. So I'd like to remind folks that we have a long tradition of respectful interactions at these meetings. Questions are encouraged. Incivility and personal attacks are not welcome and won't be tolerated. So with that said, we're going to move into the program. And I also want to say that as Jacqueline is talking tonight, she's going to talk about her research at the Leonard Preserve near Manchester. And very delighted, can I say it? Okay, very delighted. This just came together over dinner. We're going to have an outing Sunday, May 15th, 1 to 3 p.m., limited to 20 people. Watch for it on Meetup. We are going to ask for a small contribution to defray the cost of that particular outing. So again, if you watch this presentation and go, oh, wow, I'd like to see that close up and personal, you will have that opportunity on Sunday, May 15th from 1 to 3 p.m. Watch for it on Meetup. Okay, give us a minute here while we move some components around and then we'll begin. Welcome, Dr. Corteau.
So since you all can't see the screen, what I'm going to do is turn my computer.
And give me a second because I also need to get this USB on like.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Small period of adjustment.
Is it okay if I move this?
Yeah. Okay. I'm not connected to the camera right now.
I'll bring it as close.
I just need to present and then we're good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about the Leonard Preserve, which is a Washtenaw County preserve that opened in 2004. It's 259 acres, a mix of wetlands, forests, and old fields. The River Raisin, as I said, runs through it, and so there are some riparian forest areas as well. Can people hear me well enough? Okay. Just to give you a little background and the timeline of the park and this project looking at deer impact. So as I said, the park was opened in 2004. And between 2004 and 2009, the Washtenaw County Park staff started to observe a number of things that indicated to them that there were heavy deer impacts. They saw a lot of deer browsing. They saw declining populations of wildflowers, and they were concerned at the lack of tree seedlings. So they were concerned about tree regeneration. So in 2009, with the help of NATAC, the County Natural Areas Technical Advisory Committee, they put in place 2 fenced exclosures. They're called exclosures because they're excluding the deer. These are 8-foot-high fences, large wire mesh, roughly 100 meters square. That's the sizes were a little different between the 2 of them. One of these was in the forest, one was in the field, and they were put there not with the immediate intent of studying them scientifically, but just as a public demonstration. Let's just put them here, protect the area within the fence from deer and see what happens. I was hired in 2014 and 15 to do actually a study of those 2 plots. And then based on the results that I initially presented to the Washtenaw County Parks and Recreation Commission, they approved controlled hunting at Leonard starting in 2016. They have been working with a disabled veterans group, and that has continued through 2021, I believe. Dan, it did happen this last year. And then I was hired to look again at what had happened between the study I did in 2014-15 and then 2020-2021. Here are a couple of pictures. This is, at this distance, it's probably really hard for you to see, but lots of trilliums inside the fence, not much outside, and even more pronounced by 2021. Here is inside the fence. You can see lots of white dots there. Those are the trilliums blooming, and outside the fence, you can't see them. So just quickly to keep you oriented, I'm going to talk about 3 different areas that I studied in detail and a couple of different observation areas, the forest in the north, and then some areas nearby this forest exclosure that I did some observations in. The grassland exclosure is down in the south. There's an old field with oaks recolonizing in the center. And then I want to tell you about some orchids I observed. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the methods, and so I'm just going to go by this really quickly. But basically, there was a fence plot that was established to begin with. The species overlap between the forest and the field was almost non-existent. So it was really a comparison of 1. So I established both a near and a farther distant unfenced plot for comparison, so I could check whether the trends were in the same direction. And I'm just going to briefly say I did a range of study methods. Some of them were systematic, where I focused on a particular species and found all I could. Some of them were random samples, where I just had my little meter or quarter-meter square plot, and I would just randomly choose a number of meters and walk this way and that way and put it down. So I did both kinds of methods. I'm going to start with the forest plots in the north. And the forest in the spring of 2021. So this is after those fences had been in place for 12 years. Even excuse me, the differences were even more dramatic in 2021 than they had been in 2014. So you can see again, here's the forest, or sorry, the fence, the trilliums inside, or the plants inside are big, and you can see a lot of trilliums blooming. Outside and throughout, really that whole forest area pretty much bare. Anything in bloom was quite rare and typically restricted to underneath logs or fallen branches. Here's an example of my random plot. So this is from inside the fence. You can see lots of lush growth. You can see a trillium blooming. You can see a wild geranium blooming. The random plot on the outside. Here's the little bitty trillium plant that was there. So the plants are there in lower numbers, but they're much smaller and they don't have the resources to bloom. And then here, just as the series of comparisons of the on the upper row, excuse me, that's one of the two unfenced plots, and the lower row, the fenced plots. So these are these randomly placed plots, and you can see that overall much denser, much taller growth and more flowers below. This is the count. So I spent a lot of time counting. These are for full plots. On the left is the fence plot, the middle is the near unfenced plot, and the right is the more distant unfenced plot. You can see there's almost nothing blooming in the unfenced plot. So pink in this picture is the trillium, the darker pink is wild geranium, and the purple is wild blue phlox. So many, many more flowers of all those species inside the fence plots than in either of the two unfenced plots where deer are present. Similarly, looking at summer wildflowers, including blue stem goldenrod, woodland sunflower, smooth aster, and calico aster. In this, again, the fence plots are on the right, the first 4 bars compared to the near and the farther unfenced plot. And in this image, green is plants that did not flower. So that's the number of plants we found with no flowers. And then yellow are the ones that were flowering. So here again, you can see that most of the flowers, the yellow parts, are in the fence. So both there are more plants overall and more of them are flowering. So taking a detailed comparison from one sample period to the next, trillium flowering decreased in both of the unfenced plots. So the first year I studied, there were some trillium flowering outside the fence, but just not as many. But that number went down to almost 0, or I think it was 0 actually in both of those unfenced plots. And indeed, throughout that entire forest area, I saw maybe 4 or 5 trilliums blooming, but again, only at under fallen branches. Whereas the trillium number actually increased, the number flowering increased inside the fence, which suggests that those flowers inside the fence might still be recovering from past deer impacts, because at a certain point they should level out. Now, this is despite the fact that deer management is happening, so it suggests that there's still strong impacts, because over time, what you would expect is that those numbers should start to level off and potentially be pretty similar if the deer were controlled enough that trillium could recover on the outside. This red dotted line indicates a flowering rate of 30%. And a National Park Service study has suggested that flowering rates below that suggest that deer impacts are too high and that management should be done. So you can see that when the study started, we were just at that level in the exposure of recovering to that 30% level, and it's continued to increase. Just quickly, wild blue phlox is one where the first study in 2014, it didn't look like deer were affecting this species. It was scattered sort of here and there through the forest, and there were actually more plants flowering outside the exposure than in. So it did not look like a case of strong deer impacts. But over the course of time, The number of phlox flowering inside the fence grew greatly, while those flowering outside plummeted to very few, again, 6 or 8. And those impacts on flowering are reflected also in plant size. So I measured a lot of plants, thousands actually, in between the forest and field, and geraniums, the pink on the right. As you can see, the plant size went down a little bit in these random plots from one measurement point to the next, but increased significantly inside the fence. Trout lily increased inside the fence, stayed roughly the same outside the fence. Sadly, I can't show you data on trout lily flowering because my measurement times didn't fully capture it. But just the overall point about plant size is that plant size is important because until plants are big enough, they don't have the resources to flower. Deer browse doesn't necessarily kill plants outright. Many plants can recover, but it does rob a lot of resources. So typically the year after browsing, especially these spring ephemerals, which have a very short growing season, they'll be much smaller the year after browse, and they usually can't bloom in that year after browse, depending on when in the season it occurred. And this is just a picture to show you how big and stout and healthy the trout lilies are inside the fence. Similar size plot outside the fence. This one actually doesn't have trout lilies, but you can see this little tiny little, literally that tall bloodroot, a couple of those, one little baby trillium plant. Okay, and very similar settings and plots overall. And again, I was not able to fully assess trout lily flowering, but there were more trout lilies flowering in this one patch. This was about 12 or 13 than I saw in either of the other 2 full plots, the full 100 square meters that were unfenced. I've been focusing on wildflowers, but of course this is a forest and we know trees are important and we want to see some tree regeneration. That was one of the concerns of the county park. So I did survey the number and size of the full range of tree species that were in all of these plots. I'm going to focus here on oaks. Oaks are important because they are the food source for over 400 species of insects. And those insects are the food then for many of our beloved forest songbirds. As you can see, there were many more oaks inside the fence, the green bar, than in either of the unfenced plots, the blue and orange bars. And those trees were also taller on average by a significant amount. I mean, 5 centimeters, which is 2 inches, might not seem like a lot, but over time that adds up. And the other thing is you might expect that if there were more trees, they would have been smaller because there would have been more competition. But clearly the protection from deer browsing is allowing them to be both more abundant and bigger. And again, it's important because oaks are the dominant species of this forest and are an important resource for so many critters in it. I just want to return to a slide that I showed you earlier to just remark that when I went throughout this northern forested area beyond the plots, all along the riverside, this was the general pattern that I saw. I very rarely saw trilliums blooming, except, as I said, underneath fallen branches, and similarly with the phlox and the wild geraniums. And there were some trillium on one steep slope, but this was in contrast to my first study in 2014, that spring when I visited, when there had been more trillium in that area. So my general observation is that the results from my exclosure study are reflecting a broader decline in this part of the park. And again, the importance, trillium is a food source for ants who eat its little eliosomes and then disperse its seeds. Both excuse me, wild geranium and wild phlox. A number of our pollinators, our native bees feed on them. And tree saplings and seedlings, all that branchy growth in the understory form the important structure for arthropods to spiders to build their nests. And all of those species feed, again, a whole suite of our forest songbirds. So it's not just the plants that are being affected, it's the whole food webs. So I want to move on to the grassland area, excuse me, in the southern part of the park. Similarly, this area had an exclosure, and I'm sorry, it's going to be hard to see at that distance, but you can see here within the fence, pretty dense growth of a lot of wildflower or floor plants, and outside the fence, it's just a grassy plain. So again, inside you can see here are some things blooming, little patches of yellow. Outside, mostly grasses. Here is one look at the number of and types of flowers that were blooming inside the fence, which is the left bar versus outside. Again, overall, there were fewer species flowering, fewer stems of flowers, and the plant heights were in general smaller. And so again, the smaller the stem, the fewer flowers it had on it. Often if the deer had browsed it, they had browsed it down, so there might be only 1 or 2 flowers left. Here are some of the different wildflowers that I was looking at in this fall measurement time. And again, I measured hundreds of these plants. So this is the average plant heights of a series of focal species, including tall white lettuce, several of the different goldenrod species, stiff goldenrod, early goldenrod, tall goldenrod, as well as smooth aster. And in almost all cases, other than wild bergamot, the plants were significantly taller inside the fence. Wild bergamot was an interesting one because one plot, unfenced plot, they were shorter, but the other they weren't, so not a clear pattern there. Again, here's a look at my random plots, just plunking my little subplot frames down. You can see a whole, but I had to do a different angle because I couldn't, looking down, couldn't show you all the many goldenrods that are blooming in this 1/4 meter square plot compared to this 1/4 meter square plot where you see a couple of black-eyed Susans, but not a lot else in bloom. And here, this is stiff goldenrod blooming inside the random plot here, which is a beloved nectar food for a range of our pollinators. It was present in a basal rosette form in the outside plots, but there was not a single stem of it blooming anywhere in that field outside the fence. Now, in addition to the fall flowers in the field, there were a few spring things this time around that I had not been in bloom when I did the 2014 study, so I can't compare. But black raspberry and gray dogwood, both of which are, again, pollinator beloved plants, were blooming profusely inside the fence and much more rarely outside the fence. There were some black raspberries in bloom in the more distant unfenced plot, but interestingly, we didn't observe any bees there, whereas you didn't even have to observe the bees inside the fence. You could listen to the bees and hear them buzzing. Now, it is the case that many pollinators are less likely to visit low density flower patches. So it might be that once the flowers drop below a certain density, they're just less likely to attract pollinators or support pollinators. Excuse me, and here again, looking at the comparison from one year to the next, what you can see in these bars, so it's the fenced and the 2 unfenced plots, and the yellow and purple and lighter yellow for one year, and then the next show the goldenrods and the aster. Interestingly here, that some of the flowering rates did go, or flower numbers did go down somewhat, even inside the fence. But they're still significantly lower in the two control plots. And then well, since you guys can't see these, well, I'm realizing this might be a really confusing slide. This is a slide that shows not simply the number of stems that are flowering, but I literally counted every single flower on the stem to again show you that, you know, stems that are browsed by deer might still manage to flower and have a few flowers and be considered a flowering stem, but they might just have many, many, many fewer flowers, which is, it's literally 10 times more flowers inside the fence than outside the fence for these couple of species. And here again, it's just a reminder that we're not just talking about the plants, we're talking about whole food webs. So every one of the species that I showed on that earlier graph are valuable to our native bees, to wasps, to butterflies and moths. Some of them even are hummingbird food. Birds like many of the flowers and feed on them or feed on the nectar, but also they feed on those other insects. And then small mammals as well often eat some of the seeds. So when deer are reducing the numbers of plants, reducing the number of flowers, they're affecting a whole range of other species. Moving on to the central area, this is where I studied oaks recolonizing an old field. And in 2015, I had an undergraduate student who was doing this as a project, and we had access to this, our collector system. So we literally mapped all the oak seedlings and saplings we found in this area along an old hedgerow of bur oaks. The colors indicate different amounts of browsing. So first we assessed, was it browsed by a deer, yes or no? We also did look at small mammal browse, and it was present, but not in the same amounts. I'm not showing that here. So the closer to red the color is, the higher the level of browsing. A red dot indicates that 50% or more of the branches on it and that sapling were browsed. And that's a level that's likely to lead to higher mortality and means that the seedling or sapling can't really succeed. The green dots are the unbrowsed, and the yellow and orange were intermediate levels of browse. So looking at that from one year to the next, interestingly, if you look at the total number of browsed stems, again, the red is more than 50% browsed, and the orange is, some browse, but up to 50%, whereas green is no browsing. The over amount of browse was similar, but what happened was the browse intensity went down considerably. So you have far fewer oak saplings in this red level of 50% or more branches browsed. And just to try to show you, this is what some of them look like. Literally every branch browsed. I mean, here's one that's not, but every single tip on some of these saplings is browsed. And here I was trying to show with the two measuring sticks how that looked with all these branches browsed. But when that browse intensity went down, by the second sampling time, 20% of the seedlings had managed to escape the deer browse zone. So the deer browse zone is typically considered 6 inches to 6 feet. If you have heavy snow cover, it can be even taller. I've seen deer stand on their hind feet to browse, so sometimes it might be 7 feet. But you can see, this is me there, so you can see this was, I think this one was about 9 feet tall. So although the deer are browsing these seedlings, they're doing it at a lower intensity, which is allowing enough of these seedlings to escape deer browsing that in this area of the park, we can say, you know, management seems to be allowing for tree regeneration success. And I just want to close with this little observation. Newly discovered orchid, not discovered, newly observed for this park orchid. This was not seen in this inventory that park staff had done in 2008 through 10. They did some pretty intensive surveying. We had not seen it when we were in the park in 2014 and 15. We saw 7 or 8 of these in the spring of 2021. Orchids are particularly sensitive to deer browse. Tony Resnichek, who runs the Michigan Flora Project, has said that they are one of the species that will often disappear before you even know that the deer browse effects are heavy. So seeing this orchid suggests that in this part of the park, the deer impacts are moderating. And so this is just a summary, which you probably can't see very well at this distance. That just gives you the highlights of what I've gone through for, high and even increasing deer impacts in the northern forest area, moderating impacts, but still for some species high in the grassland area. In that oak regeneration or oak recolonization area, there are still impacts, but enough oaks are managing to succeed that we might be doing okay there. And then this orchid observation in the south is a great sign that some plants are succeeding. So what are the implications of some of this? Well, deer management does seem to be linked to some recovery of those some areas of the park, again, where the orchids are in that area where the oaks are doing better. So continued effort at management seems to be likely to help some of those grassland pollinators. The impacts do continue very high in the northern part. So that suggests that more management is needed or more intensive management efforts. So what are some of the long-term implications of deer impacts continuing at this high rate? If deer are not controlled, plant populations can decline. They can even disappear from the site. And the preserves in our urbanizing area are little islands of biodiversity. When plants disappear from one site, there just might not be seed sources nearby to reinvigorate and reseed those areas. But again, as I've tried to emphasize, in addition to the plants themselves, when plants are browsed heavily and when flowers and fruits are not there, there are lower resources for pollinators, for fruit eaters, butterflies, native bees, a whole range of species, and ultimately birds. Over time, reduced forest regeneration in the northern part could mean that our forests are not able to replace themselves and might gradually convert to shrublands or grasslands. Again, that center area, that field is recolonizing with oaks. So we might have a shift of where the forests are going to exist. And that loss of forest structure does affect many species, as well as water quality, flood control, and erosion control. So just a few reflections on management. When you're thinking about deer impacts, you want to know what the population is. But other factors are also important when we have this patchwork landscape of fields and preserves. So how long the deer are there, what length of time, what intensity they're browsing. Are they coming to the same area and browsing over and over and over? Some studies have shown that predators can affect the behavior and movement of deer and possibly control efforts like hunting. Many people have observed that deer become much more wary and move around a lot more with the presence of people in their areas where there is hunting. And again, that seasonal resource availability. So that northern forest area with all the tasty spring wildflowers is clearly a choice area for the deer to hang out and get their spring meal after a long winter of eating twigs and buds. So where the deer might be partly hitting some areas harder in key areas of the season. Excuse me. I just want to step back and think just broadly when we think about deer and managing deer or really any policy situation. One option is always to do nothing. We can just decide, you know what, we're not going to manage. In your home landscape, that might mean that you do certain things, but in a natural area, it might mean other things. So just big picture ecological think, you know, when a population is not going to control, it's eventually, when it's not controlled, it will eventually become controlled by starvation or disease in the absence of predators. So over time, that's what could happen. But in the meantime, we could lose a lot of species from our preserves and a lot of biodiversity. A lot of people who are gardeners think, well, let's plant deer-resistant plants. That's a great option for gardening, but it's not effective for a natural area. And furthermore, deer preferences vary a lot by location and by the particular deer. And I can assure you almost every list of deer-resistant plants I've seen some on that list that I say, oh, no, I've seen that one browsed a lot, or that one doesn't get browsed on my site. So deer do have pretty varied preferences. Deer repellents are another thing that people like to use in their home gardens. And those can be effective. They do tend to require repeat applications. Again, you can't really use deer repellents easily on 259 acres, given the cost and the need to apply it repeatedly. And then fencing. So, you know, it might be that ultimately you want to fence an area with all the spring flora to just make sure that some of them survive, but large scale fencing is costly. It requires continued maintenance. It might introduce other indirect effects. And it also totally changes the experience of being in a park. So again, there might be some targeted uses for large scale fencing, but it's probably not a practical solution. And so, you know, then you get to deer management of some kind. That could be population control measures such as sterilization or birth control. And I should note that the Eagle in Michigan has not approved any of the existing birth control medications right now for free ranging deer because of the concerns that people could eat the meat and it's not clear that those are safe for human consumption. And then population reduction, that can be a cull, which is a form of euthanasia or some kind of controlled hunt. So another question that often comes up is, well, like, okay, you've shown deer are important, but what about all these other things that are happening? We have fragmentation, we have climate change, you know, deer aren't the only thing. What about all the other interactions that might be happening out there with invasive species? And I just want to briefly say that yes, of course, all of those factors are important. And that these multiple stressors can actually amplify each other. So if you have, for instance, with climate change, you have increased droughts, maybe not full-scale long season droughts, but drought episodes, or you have flooding rains. Droughts can increase insect attack. That can further reduce the resources. You have a stress plant, insects that have attacked it, now you have deer come in and browse that. It might just be, you know, one stressor too many. And then longer term, when deer are causing reductions in the number of plants that are flowering, that's reducing the reproductive capacity of those plants. So they might not be able to reseed. So after a drought, if some plants die off, there just might not be the seed sources to replenish. What about habitat fragmentation? Well, of course, that's the thing that makes all of this even more pressing. We have a very patchwork, fragmented landscape where we have these little islands of diversity with lots of agricultural building areas around them where seeds can't move freely across the landscape. So again, if you have plants growing in this fragment and deer are coming in and browsing the flowers, browsing the fruits before they get a chance to actually reproduce, then you're really cutting into the possible continuity of biodiversity in that site. So what deer are doing really is amplifying the threat. It's not that they're more important than habitat fragmentation, but in a fragmented habitat, they make things worse. And then similarly with invasive species, deer can serve as agents to disperse invasives. They cause a lot of disturbance that might make the invasives seed in more easily. In some cases, deer seem to prefer the native plants. That's not uniform across all of them. Deer do seem to love like fresh sprouts of honeysuckle, but once they get too big, they don't eat them. So if invasive species are taking up a lot of area and we already have less area for our native plants, and then deer are preferentially browsing the native plants, you can see that that will over time be a problem. So I'm going to stop there. I welcome any questions. Just want to give a quick shout out and thanks to Sean Severance with the county parks who initiated the first study, and Allison Kruger who initiated the second. A bunch of folks who helped on my research, and then Tony Resnick, who always is helpful on plant IDs. And then thank you to the Washtenaw County Parks and Rec Commission for commissioning me to do these studies. So thank you so much. I'll be happy to do any questions. Yes.
So the big plot that you looked at overall the park is 259 acres, you said?
Yes.
So do they have an estimate as to what the size of the deer herd is coming through there in that zone? That's causing it?
They have done several counts. I don't have that on the tip of my tongue. Dan, do you remember those numbers?
The only thing that I know is that in hunting seasons, they've taken out about 5 or 6 each time, and they're certainly not taking all of the deer. They use the park, so upwards from this.
I can get back to Dan with the numbers that I know if he wants to. I think they have done at least 3 or 4 counts, and they haven't been persuaded that they've gotten all the deer, because deer can sometimes hide pretty effectively when you're doing a flyover, if they're conifers or whatever. So the numbers were kind of bounced around from one year to the next more than the hunting numbers would have suggested, but I'll get that information for you.
Yeah, we have a couple questions from chat. One is a question on if you think that the deer hunt is is it doing what it's meant to do? Is it carrying out its mission, or is it worth it? Is another way to phrase it.
Could you repeat the question?
So the question was, is the deer hunt worth it? Is it being effective? Clearly, there are continued high impacts in some parts of the park, but impacts are moderating in other parts. You might look at that and say, oh, well, it's not effective, or you might look at that and say, well, we need more targeted management in some parts of the park. I will point out, though, that this particular deer hunt has not only management, benefits for the vegetation as the goal, but also providing opportunity for disabled vets to hunt. And so from that perspective, I guess it's gotten a lot of positive feedback. And so it is effective for one of the reasons for the hunt, but for the plants, my general impression is more is needed, especially in that northern forest where there are continued and increasing effects.
Are other mammals, squirrels and rabbits and so forth, able to go through the fence?
So I meant to show you, this is about a 6 by 8 mesh size. So yes, rabbits nest inside the fence. I certainly have seen signs of chipmunk and squirrel damage. I'm not sure coyotes could get through, but foxes probably could. One thing it might be limiting besides deer is wild turkeys, which there are some signs of, there were some signs of some wild turkey impacts on the edge of one of the unfenced plots. It's not that wild turkeys could not fly into those fences. They can certainly fly that distance. They could land on top and get in. But they don't seem to, maybe with that small plot. So basically these fences are allowing free passage of anything up to probably coyote size.
We have more from chat if you're interested. Someone is just asking, which I don't know if you know this, but why are there so many deer in the first place?
Well, that's the history of deer population in Michigan is long and arduous. We know when Native Americans were here, they were actively managing the landscape in part to affect hunting. And when they were effectively removed from the landscape, deer numbers grew, but then they were hunted almost to extirpation, which is local extinction. So by the late 1890s in Michigan, there were virtually no deer in lower Michigan, and very few deer in parts of northern Michigan. That's the point at which what was then, I believe, the Department of Conservation ended up getting started, and hunting restrictions were put in place. And there were some pretty severe hunting restrictions from starting in the early 1900s, I think around 1904, all the way through the 1920s. There were many counties where no hunting was allowed or where the numbers were very, very limited. Over time, deer populations started to rebound with that control on hunting. And of course, at the same time, we totally got rid of all predators. So populations were bounding when hunting was not allowed. But the other thing that started happening in the 1930s and 40s and continuing even until today is that we started actively managing our state game and recreation areas as habitat for deer. So vegetation was managed, plants were planted to be deer food. Fields were kept in early successional state, so some of them were mowed and kept open to be good deer habitat. So we both protected them from hunting and then made more and more and more habitat. And so there have been several waves of very large population increases. There were very high deer numbers in the 50s. There were very high deer numbers in the 80s. And then superimposing on that, then we have more and more development. So more and more housing and so on moving into areas that had been managed for deer. So it's a lot of complicated factors that have contributed, but certainly we know that in any protected area, a preserve that's out in a more rural area like Manchester or our city parks, when the deer are protected, they have no natural predators. There's nothing that's really controlling their numbers, and they reproduce quickly.
Thank you. Just quickly related to that, someone asked, is this what the deer levels we have now, are those higher than historical levels? You mentioned sometimes when they were high, were they higher than the levels now?
So the best estimates for reconstructing what the deer levels were in around the time the Europeans came here is in the range of 4 to 12 per square mile. For a long time, DNR was sort of setting 10 to 15 or 15 to 20 as a target. Most of our natural areas at this point have 50, 60, 75. The metro parks at the time they started deer management had 168 per square mile.
Wow. Thank you.
Yes.
I thought you gave a nice overview of deer at Wildflowers. But you, one of the things you sort of talked around but didn't really explain to people was that as deer browse these flowers and other plants and bushes that they eat, that you talked about they come up, they're smaller the next year. And you didn't sort of explain that because they defoliated the plants, that they are storing less energy. And so when they come up, they're smaller. So each year as the deer eat those leaves, in a few years, they kill those plants.
Yes.
Can you sort of explain that?
Thank you. I appreciate you extending that. And what happens is they get miniaturized. I mean, literally the outer plots, most of the plants that I were looking at was this size, and there are many fewer of them because over time they do die. But the fact but some of them will actually persist, so that when you put that fence around it, you can have that rebound. There are trilliums in particular are known to actually go entirely dormant sometimes after browsing, so that they might not come up at all the next year or even for 2 years, but then they might reemerge a third. Victoria Nuzzo at Cornell University has done some individual plant marking and tracking where that's the pattern that she's noticed, is that yes, they might actually die or they might go dormant, which is why when you do reduce the numbers or fence the plots, sometimes you can get a remarkable recovery.
But if they go dormant for 2 or 3 years and the deer is still there, they'll just eat them when they come on.
Exactly. And interestingly, a related issue is a lot of people like to do prescribed burns. It's good for all kinds of things in terms of controlling invasive species, controlling woody species if there are just too many woodies in a more grassland area. One of the things that a controlled burn does is it flushes the seed. So seeds that are sitting in the seed bank, often after a controlled burn, they sprout and grow, which seems wonderful. But if you do that in an area with high deer populations, and those new seedlings get come and mowed down by deer, then you've just used up your seed bank. So I would say, any land manager in an area with high deer populations might want to think carefully about when and how to institute prescribed burning.
I was curious to know if you support the idea of bringing back a top predator like wolves.
I think that's a great idea. I don't know how practical it is, but that would actually be the most effective way to control their population.
We only lose 1% of small children a year.
There you go.
But my other comment is a story that goes back 35 years. I had a friend who was a landscaper, and he did a lot of landscaping of nice yards and suburbs and more rural houses. And he told me 35 years ago, he said, I used to be able to plant bushes that the deer wouldn't eat. He says, but now the deer are eating those.
I have noticed even in the past 5 years, and I've had other friends say this as well, deer supposedly don't like peonies because the sap is mildly toxic to them. Starting 5 years ago, some of my peonies, a few leaves here and there got browsed, and more each year. So by the end of the season last year, my plants were totally defoliated. They were just stubby stems. And a friend of mine who lives near the Arboretum has noticed the same with his peonies, which makes me wonder about the safety of the peony garden in the yard. I think that gets enough foot traffic that there might be some discouraging effect to the deer, but it does suggest that deer preferences are changing and perhaps intensifying with fewer and fewer choice plants in the landscape. They're going for
Right, they're
less
basically
choice.
starving, so they're eating things they would never have eaten before.
Right.
And that was the story that was going on 35 years ago.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that.
We have another question from the chat about how you picked the random areas that you surveyed.
I literally drew numbers from a hat. I didn't want to be within 1 meter of the fence line, so I excluded those. And then I had 1 through 8, and I would pick one number and go that many meters one direction, and 1 through 9 for the other because the fences were a bit bigger, and go that. And the standard directions with each pair of numbers. Yes.
Jacqueline, do you think it's possible that the difference you saw between the regenerating oak area and the forest area could be because the hunting pressure pushed the deer to be in the forest more?
I mean, there could be a number of factors. It could be partly the hunting, although my understanding is that some of the hunting did take place in the north. Which is why then I wonder about seasonal effects, because the hunting is happening during really a very small part of the season. And the browse on tree saplings is typically late in the winter when those buds are full and the deer are really hungry, or else early in the spring when the leaves are emerging and they're tender and they're juicy and they're not really rigid and lignified yet. Another factor is, though, of course, the oaks in the central field, they were a little bit bigger to start with. They're out in the open. So they're getting a lot of sunlight, a lot of other things they need. So they might have had just enough extra from the light, from the fertility in that field that they're able to do okay. But that's a good question, Dan. Thank you. Yeah.
So, like the problem with oak browse, how long does it take an oak tree to get from little to maturity where it's producing seeds. Because, right, you need to, how to put it, you aren't going to notice the effects of deer browse at a forest scale until it's not replacing trees,
Right.
right? And so we're talking 20 years or 80 years.
So it depends on the oak species. Sometimes there are some oaks that can reproduce by about age 35. But again, of course, that depends. How repeatedly are they getting browsed? You know, if they're getting if most of their browse each year is, most of their growth each year is getting browsed back. I mean, I've seen in the George Reserve where I did my dissertation work, that's a 2-mile square fence that has a deer population in it that has been intensively studied over the years. There were oaks this tall that I'm guessing were probably 30 years old, but there was not a single bud on them. And then like the one bud would come up in the spring and then, you know, by the end of, you wouldn't see it later. And I put in some deer fences and then I started to see them actually recovering. So they can persist a fair length of time. They're taproot species. They can persist, but they're not going to thrive. So that's a really good question. How long do you have to protect them? Probably 30 years to get 35 years to get a tree that will produce acorns.
I was thinking, even how long will it be before people notice that, oh, the oak trees here are dying and there aren't middle-aged oaks replacing them?
So you can do a forest survey where you look at different size classes of trees. And what we see in many of the sites that, for instance, University of Michigan classes visit in the Ann Arbor surroundings is you have very few trees between the sort of half centimeter or half inch, this tall to the sort of 4-inch diameter. You know, there's a whole cohort, they would call it, of trees that in many natural areas is missing. Now, those are the trees of the future. And if those are missing, we are going to have a period in between where we're not regenerating the trees that we need for the future, or we're changing species. So you might have a bunch of cherries, wild black cherry, which is a post-disturbance species, although that's pretty heavily browsed by deer in my experience. But you might have a shift to more deer browse tolerant species. Most of the tree species that I work with get pretty heavily browsed by deer, but sugar maples, for instance, their strategy is that they produce so many seeds and so many seedlings and saplings that you seem to get a little bit more of an escape because they just aren't browsing every single one.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, we have a couple more. Someone commented another plant of theirs that deer have started browsing, which also reminded me that a lot of the plants that we planted in the Sugarbrook Park are supposed to be deer resistant, but may not be anymore.
I'd keep an eye on it.
Someone asked if we plant an oak tree, like if you wanted to plant an oak tree, how high a fence would you need to build to protect it?
So it depends on the diameter of the fence. If you just protect the stem, you would have to go at least 6 feet tall. My experience with, I've used a lot of small fences because it's cheaper. And my experience is the deer are going to push in and they are going to, even with a 2x4 wire mesh, they will end up browsing a foot inside the fence because they'll push in and they'll reach to get whatever's close. So you probably want to do at least a 4-foot circle. You have to use really solid posts because they will press. And at that size, they wouldn't jump in and out, but you'd have to do 6 feet tall. You can do a slightly bigger fence, but then they can jump in and out. So if you're going to go with a bigger diameter fence, then you have to do at least 8 feet. Deer can even jump an 8-foot fence, but typically won't for a small plot. If you had a fence that you were doing across a path the deer really like to go, then you'd have to maybe go to 10 feet.
Wow, thank you. Also, someone who said that they had noticed a lot more trillium and wildflowers in Western Michigan, and they were curious if there were conversations about these same types of things you brought up in the greater Michigan kind of area.
Well, I don't know about Michigan-wide discussions. A lot of the discussions I hear about are in urban or suburban areas where the concerns are parks and preserves. But I think context is really important. And if you just think about Western Michigan, Northern Michigan, there is a lot more deer hunting. And that's probably contributing to just a lower population pressure overall.
I have a question regarding the culling of the deer with the controlled hunting. I was wondering if you know how wide a group of deer will range.
Could you repeat that question?
So how widely will a group of deer range if you're doing a deer call? Anthony DeNicola of White Buffalo, which did the deer call for Ann Arbor, said that typically the call has a 3/8 of a mile effective distance. So although again, in urban areas, deer territories can be dumbbell shaped or all kinds of weird shape, but typically if you're removing the deer from right here, it's only going to be out 3/8 of a mile that you're affecting. So even in some of the Ann Arbor parks that I studied, that where deer control was happening, my plots were far enough away from where the deer control happened that I was not seeing clear changes from year to year.
I think deer can range quite a long way, so that culling in one small area wouldn't really affect it very much.
Deer can range quite a long ways, and the young males will often wander a lot. We were having this discussion earlier. I'm not a deer biologist, but I can only tell you what I've heard from people I know who are deer biologists, which is that deer hang out in maternal clans, and those maternal clans tend to be pretty true to a territory, and they'll often stay very close in the same area. I don't know how that has changed given all the barriers in the landscape that we've put in. I don't know whether previously over time those might have gradually shifted across the landscape as resources changed. But the thinking now is that often a clan will stay pretty much where it was born and then generation after. Yeah, John, you can comment on that.
I don't hunt. I did a fair bit of research when I started to photograph deer. And apparently a hunter's rule of thumb is that does will be born and die within a square mile.
Hard to believe they can travel so easily.
But they don't. Deer, they're like an antelope. They do a short sprint, and they'll do a short sprint maybe 100 yards away from you, and then they'll stop. And they'll just hang out there. If you don't disturb them, they'll come back to where they were. Okay? That's part of why wolves are so successful hunting deer. They're endurance hunters, and they can chase the deer until they wear them down. But yeah, deer are short little sprinters. They don't travel much. Bucks, according to the hunters research I've seen, bucks, yeah, once they leave the herd, they might travel 2 to 5 miles. But they are, for being a big, fast-moving animal, they are really narrowly confined.
Perhaps when they're starving because they've eaten so many of the wildflowers, they may range farther to find food.
I think that's a good question. I'm sure that as they deplete resources, they have to change their behavior. So I think partly because our landscapes are restricted and complex, some general observations about deer behavior in a large natural area might actually be very different than what we would see in a smaller, more urban setting. So.
Thank you for
Yeah,
your presentation. I'm
let's,
sorry.
No, this is the perfect time to wrap up. First of all, let's extend some appreciation. You gave us a lot to think about. I want to remind,
Yep.
I want to remind people
that if you'd like to see for yourself where this research took place at the Leonard Preserve, watch for the meetup, May 15th, 1 to 3 p.m. There may be a small donation associated with that to defray the cost. And also next Tuesday night, come write letters to low inclination voters from Argus Farm Stop, 6 to 8 p.m. And come see us next month when Bob Sutherland will be our presenter talking about peace, love, and cherries. And thanks for coming, everybody, and thanks for being patient with our technical difficulties that we had tonight.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, everybody, that this was not easier for you to see.
It worked okay.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. Thanks.
We got a bunch of things from the chat.
It was a good idea.